He left the camp on his own 2 feet. That was the first thing Hugh Barrow told the inquiry, and it was the first thing that made no sense. Sir Edmund Harwick was not a man who walked into the dark alone. He was not a man who left without word, without reason, without telling his escudero where he was going and when he would return. In 15 years of service, 15 years of campaigns, of marches, of nights spent in worse conditions than this, Edmund had never once left without telling Hugh, not once. But on the night of October 22nd, 1415, 3 days before one of the most consequential battles in English history, Sir Edmund Harwick walked out of the English encampment near the village of Agincourt, disappeared into the dark of the French countryside, and was never seen again. No body, no struggle, no explanation, just a man who went somewhere he trusted, to meet someone he trusted, and did not come back. The inquiry lasted 4 days. It reached no conclusion. The army had a battle to fight, and a missing knight, however respected, was not enough to stop the machinery of war from grinding forward. On October 25th, Henry V of England faced a French army 4 times the size of his own and won one of the most improbable victories in medieval history. The dead were buried, the living moved on. And Sir Edmund Harwick became, in the official record of the campaign, a man who had deserted on the eve of battle. He had not deserted, but the truth of what happened on that October night would not surface for 23 years. And when it did, it came in the form of a leather pouch pulled from the earth by a Norman peasant digging a well containing a ring, a piece of parchment, and 4 words that reopened everything. Before we get to those 4 words, you need to understand the world Edmund Harwick was living in during those final days. Because this was not a simple disappearance, and it was not a simple crime. It was the product of a web of secrets so tightly wound that pulling any single thread risked unraveling everything, and at least 3 people in that encampment understood this with complete clarity. Edmund Harwick was born in Yorkshire in 1377, the 2nd son of a minor noble family, whose land was modest and whose name was respectable without being remarkable. He had been knighted at 22 after distinguishing himself in a campaign in Wales, and had spent the following 16 years building a reputation as precisely the kind of knight that medieval armies needed, and medieval histories often forgot, not a hero, not a great commander, but a solid, reliable, intelligent man who did what was asked of him and did it well, and who had accumulated over those years a quality that was rarer than courage in a military camp. He was trusted, not universally, not by everyone, but by the people who mattered, and in the ways that mattered. Edmund Harwick was a man whose word meant something. Henry V valued him. His fellow knights respected him. His escudero, Hugh Barrow, would have followed him into any situation without question. Which was why, when Hugh woke on the morning of October 23rd and found Edmund's bedroll empty and his sword still sheathed at the side of the tent, the first thing he felt was not fear. It was confusion. Edmund without his sword was Edmund incomplete, a man who had not dressed himself before leaving, a man who had gone somewhere he considered entirely safe. Hugh waited an hour, then 2. Then he went to find Sir Robert Kane. Robert Kane had been Edmund's closest friend for 20 years. They had grown up on neighboring estates in Yorkshire, had been knighted in the same ceremony, had fought in the same campaigns, had shared the specific intimacy of men who have been afraid together and survived together and built something between them that most people never find. They were, by every external measure, brothers in everything but blood. Robert was 36 years old in October of 1415. He was lean and dark-haired, with the kind of stillness about him that people sometimes mistook for calm, and that was, in fact, the stillness of a man who had learned very early to show nothing on the outside while everything moved on the inside. He was sitting outside his tent when Hugh found him, eating bread in the thin October morning light, and his face when Hugh told him Edmund was gone produced, for just a fraction of a second, an expression that Hugh could not name at the time and would spend 23 years trying to describe. It was not surprise, or rather it was the performance of surprise. The eyebrows, the stillness, the careful arrangement of concern. But underneath it, in the eyes, in the set of the jaw, in the fraction of a second before the performance began, was something else entirely. Something that Hugh filed away in the part of his mind reserved for things he did not yet understand. He told himself he was wrong. Robert was Edmund's closest friend. Robert loved Edmund. Robert would no more harm Edmund than he would harm himself. He told himself this for 23 years. Lord Thomas Ashford received the news of Edmund's disappearance in his command tent, surrounded by maps and logistics documents and the general apparatus of a man responsible for several hundred lives. He was 52 years old and had been a military commander for nearly 30 years, a man so thoroughly accustomed to the compression of emotion that feeling had become, for him, a largely theoretical concept. He listened to Hugh's account with the focused attention of a senior officer assessing a tactical problem and asked 3 questions. Where was Edmund last seen? When did Hugh notice his absence? Was there any indication Edmund had left voluntarily? Hugh answered all 3. Ashford noted his responses. He called for an inquiry and assigned 2 of his subordinate knights to conduct it. What he did not say, what he would not say to anyone, at any point, during the 4 days that followed, was that he knew something about Edmund Harwick that gave him a very specific and very personal interest in ensuring that the inquiry reached no uncomfortable conclusions. 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1412, Edmund had been present during a campaign in Normandy in which Ashford had made a decision that was not in the official record and that Ashford had spent 3 years ensuring stayed that way. It was not a battlefield decision. It was a financial one, a negotiation with a Norman landowner that had produced, for Ashford, a private arrangement of considerable value, conducted in a manner that would have been characterized by anyone with authority to characterize it as corruption. Edmund had witnessed part of it, not enough to prove anything, but enough to ask questions that Ashford could not afford to have asked, especially not now, especially not 3 days before a battle that would determine the shape of everything that followed. Edmund had never asked those questions. He had never threatened Ashford. He had simply known, and Ashford had known that he knew, and the 2 men had maintained for 3 years a relationship of perfectly cordial mutual awareness that was, under its surface, a permanent standoff. In the last week of the campaign, something had changed. Edmund had been seen speaking with one of the king's personal clerks, a conversation that lasted nearly 20 minutes, and that Ashford's informant had been unable to get close enough to overhear. Ashford did not know what had been said. He did not know whether Edmund had finally decided to speak. He only knew that the conversation had happened and that Edmund had disappeared 4 days later. He conducted his inquiry efficiently. It reached no conclusion. The army moved forward. Père Guillaume was saying the morning office when Hugh came to find him on the morning of October 23rd. He was a small man, 55 years old, with the particular physical quality of someone who had spent decades making himself unobtrusive in rooms full of larger and louder people. He had been attached to the English army as chaplain through a chain of ecclesiastical appointments that he had not sought and had not resisted, because Guillaume had long ago concluded that God's will and his own preferences had very little to do with each other, and that the most honest response to this was simple compliance. He had heard Edmund's confession on the afternoon of October 22nd, the afternoon before the disappearance. He heard confessions regularly. Soldiers before battles were reliable penitents, producing the kind of urgent, comprehensive contrition that only proximity to death reliably generated. Edmund's confession had been different. Not in kind, in weight. Guillaume had sat in the small canvas confessional for 45 minutes while Edmund spoke, and when it was over, he had given absolution in the correct form and had watched Edmund leave with the specific feeling of a man who has just been handed a weight he is not sure he can carry. The seal of confession was absolute. Guillaume could not speak of what he had heard, could not confirm or deny its content, could not indicate by any word or gesture what Edmund had told him. This was not a rule Guillaume struggled with. It was the architecture of his vocation. He had kept confessional secrets for 30 years without difficulty. This one was different. Not because the secret was worse than others he had kept, though it was serious, but because of what happened the following morning. Because when Hugh came to tell him Edmund was gone and Guillaume understood, in the space between one breath and the next, what the absence meant and what had caused it, he could not say a single useful word to anyone. He requested a transfer to another unit the following day. The request was denied. He stayed and said his offices and watched the inquiry proceed and felt the weight of what he carried increase daily until it had become something he was no longer certain he could describe in human terms. He stopped sleeping. This was noticeable. Several people remarked on it. No one asked why. Isabelle de Montfort was 34 years old and had been a widow for 4 years. Her husband, Arnaud de Montfort, had been a minor Norman noble who had died in an earlier English campaign, not in battle, which would have been clean, but in the confused aftermath of a skirmish, in circumstances that Isabelle had spent 4 years trying not to think about too precisely. She lived in a stone farmhouse 2 kilometers from the English encampment, with 2 servants and a garden that produced enough to sustain them through the Norman winters. Edmund had come to her village 6 times during the campaign, under the official pretext of negotiating local supply arrangements, grain, livestock, the practical transactions of an army that needed to eat. These negotiations were genuine. Edmund conducted them honestly and with considerably more courtesy than most English officers showed to the Norman population they were moving through. But the 6th visit had lasted 3 hours longer than any negotiation required, and the 7th visit, which was not recorded in any official document, had lasted until after dark. Hugh Barrow knew about Isabelle. He had accompanied Edmund on the official visits and had waited outside while Edmund conducted his business, and he was not a young man who lacked the capacity to observe the obvious. He had said nothing, because it was not his place to say anything, and because Edmund was not a man whose private affairs he felt entitled to judge. What Hugh did not know, what he would not know until much later, was that Isabelle de Montfort had information that nobody in the English camp possessed. Information that she had acquired not through Edmund, but through her own networks, the quiet civilian intelligence of a woman who had learned to survive in a landscape crossed by armies, who spoke to everyone and was noticed by no one, and who understood the shape of things in that encampment with a clarity that might have surprised the men who made decisions there. She knew something about Robert Kane. She had known it for 3 weeks. She had not known what to do with it. Sir Miles Vance was 44 years old and had the specific quality of a man who had been resentful for so long that the resentment had become structural, built into the way he held his shoulders, the way he entered rooms, the particular edge in his voice when he spoke about anything adjacent to the things he felt he had been denied. The dispute over the Yorkshire land grant 2 years earlier had not been the origin of this quality. It had simply been its most recent expression. He had threatened Edmund publicly, and had meant it privately, and had done nothing about it, which was the pattern of his life. Large gestures, followed by the paralysis of a man who wanted things but could not quite bring himself to reach for them directly. When Edmund disappeared, Miles was questioned as a matter of course. He answered with the aggrieved dignity of someone who considered being questioned an insult and who understood simultaneously that his previous threat had made questioning inevitable. He had an alibi for the night of October 22nd, 3 men who had been dicing with him until well past midnight in a tent on the eastern edge of the encampment. All 3 confirmed it without hesitation. His alibi was genuine. Miles Vance had not killed Edmund Harwick, and the inquiry correctly cleared him within 2 days. But his presence in the story mattered in a different way, because Miles had been watching Robert Kane for weeks before the disappearance, with the specific, focused attention of a man who was looking for weakness in an enemy and who had found, or thought he had found, something he could use. He had not yet decided what to do with it. And then Edmund disappeared, and Miles looked at Robert's face during the inquiry and understood something he had not understood before. He filed it away. He was not a man who acted quickly. He was a man who waited. Margaret Harwick had been Edmund's wife for 11 years. She was in Yorkshire, 300 miles away, managing the family estate with the practical competence of a woman who had learned early that her husband would be absent more than present and that the household would not run itself. She was 35 years old and not naive about the realities of a long marriage conducted mostly at a distance. The letter she had sent Edmund 3 weeks before his disappearance had been written on a Tuesday evening in early October at the writing table in the house in Yorkshire that Edmund had not slept in for 7 months. It was 3 pages long. Hugh Barrow had delivered it personally, placing it in Edmund's hands outside the supply tent on a grey afternoon, and had watched Edmund's face as he read it. Hugh had a gift for faces. He had always had it the ability to read the precise emotional content of an expression with a speed and accuracy that most people could not match. It was not a skill he advertised. It was simply how he saw the world. Edmund's face, while reading Margaret's letter, had gone through 4 distinct expressions in the space of 3 pages. The first was the ordinary blankness of a man beginning to read. The second was attention. Something in the letter had caught him, made him focus. The third was a particular compression around the eyes that Hugh associated with the processing of unwelcome information. And the fourth, the expression that Hugh would remember for 23 years with complete clarity, was the expression of a man who has just understood that something he thought was private is not private at all. Edmund had finished reading. He had folded the letter very carefully. He had held it for a moment. And then he had burned it in the campfire without a word, and had been quieter than usual for the rest of that day, and had not mentioned it again. Hugh had not asked. He had filed the expression away, and watched Edmund more carefully in the following weeks, and what he saw was a man making a decision, slowly, methodically, with the specific deliberateness of someone who understands that the decision they are making cannot be unmade. He never found out what was in the letter, but he carried the memory of Edmund's face with him long after everything else had faded. The inquiry into Edmund's disappearance was conducted between October 23rd and October 26th, 1415. The last day coinciding with the aftermath of Agincourt itself, when the English army was processing the scale of what it had just survived and the practical consequences of a victory that had changed everything. 2 subordinate knights appointed by Ashford questioned every person of note in the encampment. They were thorough within the limits of what they were permitted to ask and who they were permitted to question, which were limits set, implicitly but unmistakably, by Ashford himself. Robert Kane was questioned for 40 minutes on October 24th. He was cooperative, precise, and completely devastated by the loss of his closest friend. He described the last conversation he had had with Edmund 2 days before the disappearance, a routine exchange about the coming battle. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested Edmund was planning to go anywhere or meeting anyone. He had no explanation for the disappearance. He was visibly distressed throughout the questioning. The knights noted his distress. They did not note the specific quality of it, the way it sat slightly outside the natural rhythm of grief, slightly too composed in the pauses, and slightly too expressive in the moments of visible emotion, as though it had been calibrated rather than felt. They were not men trained to read those distinctions, and Robert Kane had had 24 hours to prepare. Hugh Barrow was questioned for 20 minutes. He told them about the empty bedroll, the sheathed sword, the missing Edmund. He told them about the expression on Robert's face when he had delivered the news, the fraction of a second expression before the performance began. The knights wrote down that Hugh had noticed Robert seemed surprised. They did not write down Hugh's qualifier that it was the performance of surprise, not surprise itself. Hugh was 22 years old and an escudero, and the distinction he was trying to draw was not one the inquiry was equipped to process. He left the questioning feeling that he had said something important and had not been heard. Père Guillaume was not questioned. The seal of confession was understood by everyone involved, and questioning a chaplain about what he had heard in confession was not only pointless, but theologically offensive. He was left alone with what he knew, which was perhaps the cruelest outcome the inquiry could have produced. Isabel de Montfort was not questioned at all. She was French, civilian, and 2 kilometers outside the English encampment. Her existence in relation to Edmund was not part of the official record, and the knights conducting the inquiry had no reason to know her name. On October 25th, 1415, the Battle of Agincourt was fought. The English army, exhausted and outnumbered, destroyed a French force 4 times its size in approximately 3 hours. The field afterward was a landscape of organized carnage, thousands of French dead, the logistical chaos of managing prisoners, and the practical horror of mass burial. The English army spent the following days processing the aftermath and beginning the slow movement toward the coast and home. The area of forest, 3 kilometers west of the encampment, on the French side of the loose boundary that separated the 2 armies, became in the 48 hours following the battle part of the extended burial ground that the campaign left behind. Not the main field, not the great pits where the French nobility were interred with whatever ceremony could be managed. Just a stretch of woodland where the overflow was dealt with, where the bodies that couldn't be counted or identified were put into the earth by men who were tired and cold and wanted to go home. Robert Kane had chosen that particular stretch of woodland deliberately, 2 nights before the battle, for a reason that had seemed logical at the time and that had turned out to be, in the most terrible way, inspired. He had not known the battle would overflow onto that ground, but he had known it was French territory, knew it was the kind of terrain that an English army passing through would not linger in, knew that in the confusion of a campaign, no one was going to excavate a woodland looking for a single missing knight. What he had not calculated was the scale of what Agincourt would produce. The battle turned his hiding place into a burial ground. Edmund Harwick was interred by history itself, covered over by the dead of a battle fought 3 days after his murder, in earth that no one would disturb for generations. Robert Kane sailed home with the English army in November of 1415. He was, by every external measure, the same man he had always been. He returned to Yorkshire. He managed his estate. He attended church. He was present at the official inquiry held in England in early 1416, which examined the disappearance one final time, reached the same conclusion as the French inquiry, and formally recorded Edmund Harwick as a deserter, a designation that destroyed Margaret's inheritance rights and left her in a legal position that took 3 years to partially resolve. Robert helped her through that process. He was present at every difficult moment. He was patient, reliable, and kind, in the way that only someone with something enormous to hide can be performing friendship for a widow whose husband he had murdered with a consistency and a completeness that, looking back, bordered on the monumental. Hugh Barrow watched all of it. He had returned to England after the campaign and had taken a position in the household of a minor Yorkshire noble, close enough to the world he had inhabited with Edmund to remain in contact with the people connected to his former master. He watched Robert. He watched the performance. He noted, over the years, the specific ways in which Robert's behavior deviated from the natural patterns of grief, too present, too helpful, too carefully positioned in Margaret's life in a way that served Robert's narrative more than Margaret's actual needs. He said nothing. He had no evidence. He had a fraction of a second expression and a gut certainty that had never produced anything he could take to anyone with authority. He waited. Miles Vance watched too, from a distance, with the patient attention of a man who had been waiting for the right moment for years and had learned that moments, properly waited for, eventually arrived. What Miles had noticed, in the weeks before Edmund's disappearance, was the pattern of Robert's movements in the evenings, the specific rhythm of a man who was meeting someone regularly and trying not to be seen doing it. Miles had not been able to identify who Robert was meeting. He had simply noted the pattern, filed it, and continued watching. After Agincourt, after the return to England, he continued watching from a distance and in silence, for reasons that were partly strategic and partly the simple paralysis that had always characterized his approach to action. He was still watching, from a distance, when Robert Kane died. Robert died in the winter of 1437, 22 years after Agincourt. He was 58 years old and died of a fever that took him in 10 days, the kind of death that medieval medicine could observe, and not much else. He had been ill before, had recovered, had seemed for a time as though he would outlast the fever as he had outlasted everything else. He did not outlast it. In his final days, according to the servant who attended him throughout, Robert was not at peace. He slept badly. He spoke during his sleep not coherently, not in sentences that the servant could follow, but in the urgent, fragmented register of a man working through something unresolved. He asked for Père Guillaume twice, but Guillaume had died in 1429 and could not be summoned. He asked for Hugh Barrow once, but Hugh was in another county, and the message arrived too late. On the last morning of his life, Robert asked for his writing materials. The servant brought them. Robert wrote for approximately 20 minutes, pausing frequently, breathing with visible difficulty. When he finished, he folded what he had written, placed it inside a small leather pouch together with something the servant did not see clearly, sealed the pouch, and gave it to the servant with an instruction. He said, "Take this to the field. You know the one. Bury it near the stone with the cross cut into it, at the depth of a forearm. Tell no one." The servant, who had been with Robert for 15 years and had learned not to ask questions that Robert did not invite, did as he was told. He rode to the location Robert had described, not in Yorkshire, not in England, but in Normandy, which the servant had visited with Robert twice in the years since the campaign, on journeys whose purpose Robert had never explained, and he buried the pouch at the indicated depth beside the indicated stone and returned to Yorkshire to find his employer already dead. He told no one. He had been instructed not to, and he was a man who followed instructions. He lived another 19 years and carried the knowledge of the buried pouch with him until his own death in 1456. By which point everyone connected to the original events was dead or very old, and the knowledge had nowhere useful to go. In the spring of 1438, 6 months after Robert's death, a Norman peasant named Thomas, the historical record gives only the first name, was digging a well on land that had been purchased the previous year by a minor local landowner in a village in northern France that sat in the general vicinity of the old Agincourt campaign grounds. He was working alone at a depth of approximately 2 forearms when his spade struck something that was not soil and not stone. He reached down and pulled out a small leather pouch, weathered but intact, sealed with wax that had survived better than it had any reason to. He opened it. Inside was a ring, a knight's ring, heavy silver, with a crest engraved into the face, a design that meant nothing to a Norman peasant in 1438, but that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the minor noble families of Yorkshire. And wrapped around the ring, folded carefully, was a piece of parchment. Thomas unfolded it. There were 4 words, written in English, in a hand that had clearly been unsteady when it wrote them, the hand of a man who was very ill or very old, or both. The words were, "Robert Kane did this." Thomas could not read English. He brought the pouch and its contents to the local priest, who could read Latin but not English, who sent it to a colleague in a larger town, who eventually passed it to an English ecclesiastical representative traveling through Normandy on church business, who recognized the crest on the ring as belonging to the Harwick family of Yorkshire and understood, with a clarity that required no elaboration, that he was holding something significant. The ring and the parchment reached England in the autumn of 1438. They were received by the ecclesiastical authorities and placed before a formal inquiry convened in early 1439, 23 years after Edmund Harwick had walked out of an English encampment near Agincourt and not come back. Hugh Barrow was 62 years old when the inquiry summoned him. He travelled to London in February of 1439 with the specific internal quality of a man who has been waiting for something for 23 years and has occasionally doubted whether the wait would ever produce anything. He sat before the inquiry board and told them everything he knew. The empty bedroll, the sheathed sword, the expression on Robert Kane's face in the fraction of a second before the performance began, the letter from Margaret, and the 4 expressions that crossed Edmund's face while reading it, the pattern of Robert's movements in the weeks before the disappearance that Miles Vance had also observed and that Hugh had noticed independently. He told them that he had known, from the morning of October 23rd, 1415, that Robert Kane had killed Edmund Harwick. He told them that he had had no evidence, only a 22-year-old escudero's reading of a face and a certainty that had never produced anything useful until now. The inquiry board listened. They read the parchment. They examined the ring, which Margaret Harwick's surviving daughter identified immediately and without hesitation from the family crest. They summoned Miles Vance, who was 67 years old and had been waiting, in his own way, for this conversation for 2 decades. He described what he had observed, the pattern of Robert's evening movements before the disappearance, the specific quality of Robert's reaction when Hugh had delivered the news, The behavior at the English inquiry in 1416 that Miles had watched from a distance and found, in retrospect, too careful to be innocent. They attempted to locate Isabelle de Montfort, who had left her Norman village in late October of 1415 and whose subsequent movements had left very little trace. They found, through patient inquiry among the Norman ecclesiastical records, a death notice from 1431 Isabelle de Montfort, widow, buried in a churchyard outside Rouen. She had lived another 16 years after Agincourt. She had apparently told no one anything. What she had buried in the garden of her farmhouse before leaving in 1415 was never found. The farmhouse had been rebuilt twice in the intervening 23 years, and the garden had been turned over multiple times. Whatever she had hidden there was gone. The inquiry convened its final session in March of 1439. It had Robert's own words, 4 words, written in a dying hand on a piece of parchment preserved for 23 years in a leather pouch buried in a Norman field. It had Hugh's testimony, precise and consistent, and carrying the weight of 2 decades of patient observation. It had Miles Vance's corroborating account of what he had seen before the disappearance. It had the ring, identified by the family. It had the timeline, the burial ground, the battle, the impossible coincidence of Edmund's disappearance and the subsequent flooding of that stretch of woodland with the dead of Agincourt. It had no body. It would never have a body. Edmund Harwick lay somewhere under the ground of northern France, covered by the dead of a battle fought 3 days after his murder, unreachable and unrecoverable. The inquiry's finding was recorded in April of 1439. It stated that Sir Edmund Harwick had been killed on the night of October 22nd, 1415, by Sir Robert Kane, acting alone. For reasons connected to information Edmund possessed regarding activities incompatible with his duty to the crown, it noted that Robert Kane had died in December of 1437 and could not be tried. It formally reversed the designation of desertion that had been applied to Edmund's name in 1416 and restored his honor posthumously. Margaret Harwick had died in 1431. She had not lived to see it. Her daughter, who had grown up knowing her father as a deserter and who had spent her childhood in the shadow of that designation, received the finding in the spring of 1439 and sat with it for a long time before she was able to speak about it. Hugh Barrow walked out of the inquiry building in London on the day the finding was announced and stood in the street for a while in the April cold. He was 62 years old and had spent 23 years carrying the expression on Robert Kane's face from the morning of October 23rd, 1415, the fraction of a second before the performance began, the eyes that were not surprised. He had been right. He had always been right. And for 23 years, he had had nothing but the certainty of his own observation and no way to make anyone else see what he had seen. He went home. He did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate in the precise sense. Edmund was still dead. Margaret was still dead. The ground of northern France still held what it held and would hold it forever. What existed now was a record. A name cleared, 4 words written by a dying man who had buried a ring in a Norman field and could not, in the end, take it with him. Père Guillaume had been dead for 10 years when the finding was announced. He had carried the weight of what he had heard in that confessional for 14 years and had died in 1429 with it still sealed inside him, as it was supposed to be, as the rules of his vocation required. Whether the weight had been worth what it cost him, whether there was a version of those 14 years in which the seal could have been broken and Edmund's death prevented, was a question that admitted no clean answer. and that Guillaume had been too honest to pretend otherwise. He had known. He could not speak. He had watched the inquiry proceed and reach nothing. He had lived with this and said his offices and kept his silence and died. The seal of confession is absolute. That is what made it the most consequential silence in this entire story. Robert Cain had killed his closest friend to protect a secret that died with him anyway, because whatever Edmund had been about to tell the king, Robert never knew for certain what it was. He had acted on fear, on the assumption that Edmund's conversation with the king's clerk meant disclosure was imminent. He had killed a man who trusted him completely, in the dark, 3 days before a battle that would have resolved everything one way or another, because Robert Cain could not tolerate the uncertainty of waiting 3 more days. He had then spent 22 years performing grief, helping Margaret, attending inquiries, being present at every difficult moment, and in the end, dying with the secret half intact, writing 4 words on a piece of parchment and burying them in a field in Normandy because he could not take the weight of them into whatever came next, but could not bring himself to hand them to anyone directly. It was not a confession, exactly. It was something between a confession and a stone dropped into deep water. Something released rather than surrendered. Something buried rather than offered. But it was enough. 23 years later, it was enough. You're watching The Scribe of Crimes. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming. Now, back to the field, and back to the knight who was never found. Before you go, this case left behind 8 people, and every one of them made a choice that shaped what the truth became and when it arrived. Edmund, who knew too much and trusted the wrong person with his movements. Robert, who killed his closest friend to protect a secret, and then spent 22 years in the performance of innocence, and who, in the end, could not quite let it go into the dark with him. Hugh, who read a face correctly at 22 and carried the reading for 23 years with nothing to show for it but certainty. Lord Ashford, who had his own reasons to let the inquiry reach nothing, and who shaped it accordingly, and who took his corruption to his grave without anyone ever proving it. Père Guillaume, who heard everything in a confessional and could say nothing, and who paid for that silence in a currency that has no name. Isabel, who knew something about Robert, who helped bury what she helped bury, and who left a village in October of 1415 and disappeared into 16 more years of life without ever telling anyone anything. Miles Vance, who watched and waited and waited and watched and finally, at 67, had his moment, not the moment of revenge he had imagined, but the moment of testimony, which turned out to matter more. And Margaret, who died in 1431 believing her husband had deserted, 8 years before the record was set right, the one person in this entire story who deserved the truth most and received it last. 8 people, 1 night. A battle that buried everything. 23 years. Here is the question. Robert Cain wrote 4 words on a piece of parchment and buried them in a field rather than destroy them. He could have destroyed them. He had 22 years to destroy every trace of what he had done, and he chose not to. Why? And of all the silences in this story, Hugh's certainty, with no evidence, Guillaume's sealed confession, Isabel's departure, Margaret's lifetime of not knowing which silence cost the most. Leave your answer in the comments. I'll be reading every one.